Haley Regan, you're here today with us. I'm so happy that you're here on the Our Kids, Our Schools podcast. Thanks for coming.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, so you are the Assistant Director of Community Schools for the United Way Treasure Valley. And we see around the state that there are so many resources within our communities and needs of students and families within these communities. And your organization has introduced a model called Community Schools to help access and address these needs of families within our communities around the state. And that's what we're going to talk about on the podcast today. And it's so funny because when I started this podcast, I really focused on, the premise is, centered around school communities. And then shortly thereafter, I was doing some stuff for PTA and I read about community schools. And so then I started talking with people about community schools. And then it was this funny thing, like, don't get what I'm talking about for a school community mixed up with community schools. Anyways, so that's what we're going to talk about today. But I wanted to get to a couple of basics before we talk about the community schools model. So what is the United Way? Because this is the organization that has really brought this model in. But let's talk about what United Way is first and what you guys do around the state.
Yes. So United Way is a local nonprofit. I work for the United Way of Treasure Valley. There are 6 United Ways in Idaho, and United Ways are all around the country. And our United Way focuses on mobilizing the caring power of the community to address health, education, and financial stability of every family to make sure children and families have what they need to thrive. And so that actually blends like right in with the focus of the community school strategy. And I think in this space, United Way of Treasure Valley and other United Ways have long been conveners. And folks that can kind of like take a look from the balcony level of what's going on in a community and then start researching and moving towards strategies that are evidence-based that can bring people together to solve big problems. And so United Way of Treasure Valley specifically got involved with the community school strategy over a decade ago. And it came out of a community health needs assessment for the Treasure Valley region. It was a couple counties at that time. And the data suggested that our communities had access. There were a lot of resources in the Treasure Valley between nonprofits, agencies, businesses, but there wasn't a lot of connection to resources. So there was a connection problem. Resources were not reaching families who needed them the most. And so community school strategy came up, floated up as one of those things that could be a solution to that problem. Connecting families through their neighborhood public school to resources and activities. And so that's kind of where the start got just about 10 years ago. And we can dive into that.
Yeah. Yeah. So first tell me, just take a step back for a second. So you were talking about like your organization, United Way. What are some specific projects? When my family lived in Lewiston, I saw a United Way up there, but I wasn't quite sure what they were doing. So what does the United Way, you mentioned the mission, you mentioned how you're connected to community schools and resources, but what are some specific projects you guys are working on?
And so, we have been long working on community schools, but I won't talk about that since that's what we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about. United Way of Treasure Valley has been involved in early childhood education for a number of years, with the startup of one of the examples could be the Caldwell Preschool Collaborative. And that started, over a decade ago. It was first called P16. So it was a college to career project, a collective impact project that brought multiple partners and stakeholders together. So like the school district, early childhood education providers like the YMCA and a community action partnership and the Lee Pesky Center, for example. And all those partners were working together to increase the number of seats in the preschool, in the different preschools available in Caldwell. And then they were also working together to increase the quality and coordination of preschool services to really get kids prepared to enter school. And so I think that's one of those big projects that actually kind of led to deeper community school work. Because it was like, okay, once we get our kiddos prepared for school and get them entering school, what happens next. Another project that we work on is the Western Idaho Health Collaborative, or WICHC, which is another like collaborative effort to focus on community health. And so that's bringing together health districts, health systems, education, other entities of government and nonprofit to really like work together to understand what are the biggest needs in our community, and then how can we work together as agencies to address those needs. And so right now we just completed, and I know you have a little bit of awareness of this, we just completed the largest regional health assessment to ever happen in Idaho. So we did an entire 10-county regional health needs assessment and just produced a working plan out of that, and a strategic plan of like, how are we moving forward together as partners of this health collaborative?
Yeah, I got to go to a meeting that was hosted by an affiliate group. Was it Women's Way or United Women?
Women United.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Women United. And so, I mean, for anyone listening, like if you're interested, you can be a part of Women United. Mm-hmm. And it was really amazing to sit there and listen to a couple of the women who were kind of leading the charge in terms of like their organizations and what this health community assessment was what it meant, mm-hmm. What it means for this part of the state, and all of these different groups working together to address the needs of the people within these 10 counties. And I thought that was really awesome. I mean, I was really inspired as I sat there and listened to them talk about some of the specifics, because what they did then from that was they had, after the health needs assessment, there were like 3 themes that, mm-hmm. Came to the top. And so then they were going to focus on those 3 themes.
Yeah. And the number one, I think that there were those 3 themes. And I think I'll just use the example of one of them. One of them was housing. Housing is a very, I think it's a very complex issue, and it takes a lot of partners to even address small bits of kind of the housing continuum to ensure that more families have access to housing and remain housed in our community. And it just is one of those like big problems that can feel a single agency cannot tackle it alone. So I think that gets to the heart of like the type of collaborative work United Way does.
Well, and I like the example of the housing one, because as I was sitting there, my first thought was like, okay, getting people into stable housing so that they can have that, basic need addressed in their life. But they also spoke about just other housing. I mean, it was kind of this broad bubble, right? And part of this broad bubble was that, gosh, housing is so unaffordable mm-hmm. for so many people. So how is it that we can help get people into families because the housing prices are mm-hmm. so high? So I felt like it was not just the needs that were being identified in this assessment were a large spectrum of mm-hmm. needs, wasn't just one category of people. And I think for me, that was like really significant, that they were saying, hey, here's the spectrum. And so we're going to raise these 3 categories and address the spectrum of needs. That's what I felt like was really profound for me. It wasn't just like one little category. It was trying to address the biggest spectrum in that too.
Yeah. And I think, and it's not just taking one strategy to address the need. It's like, it's going to take a lot of different strategies kind of working together mm-hmm. in these specific areas to do that, to have like that bigger picture to actually make an impact at the category of housing as a whole. And I think that is it's a good example, because I think then we can take that and like look at our work in the education sector and acknowledge that it's going to take a lot of different strategies, programs, activities, efforts to move the needle and to, to help our kids have better outcomes in education.
Agreed. Okay. So you kind of mentioned earlier how the United Way then became connected with community schools. Mm-hmm. If you wouldn't mind taking a little bit of a deeper dive into that, because I think that's valuable to note that Idaho didn't come up with this model.
No, I think it's important to note the community school strategy is a national evidence-based strategy. I think it really got its start in its modern form in the early 90s, and it, kind of was getting footholds in larger kind of like urban education settings. But it really has its root back to thinking about like John Dewey and our educational philosophers of like the early 19th century, and how, an education center can truly be the center of the community. And having, ensuring that kids have the right, stepping the right foot forward into the rest of their lives, and education systems being the place to do that. And so, we got started on the strategy work, and we immediately, I think one of the best things about this type of work is you can turn to it's a very collaborative field. And so when that community health needs assessment was conducted, I believe it was in 2013, 2014, and we identified this, our area being resource rich, but very connection poor. Families who need access to resources simply weren't connecting with them, and vice versa with the agencies providing the resources. We reached out to United Way of Salt Lake, and they had been doing this community school strategy work for about 10 years at the time. And so we can, convening a group of leaders and people who are interested in learning more from, education, government, other nonprofits, and then taking a trip down to Salt Lake to see what the community school strategy there looked like in action at school sites in South Salt Lake. And that trip really inspired people. I've heard a number of stories from our former CEO, Nora Carpenter. She was there at the time. And she just said, some of the leaders in the room, as we were like on the debrief after these site visits at these schools, and they just said, why wouldn't we do this? Like, this is a strategy that we can really address what we're seeing going on in our schools, and we can address it in like a local way. That it is truly, it's a national strategy, but it requires local implementation and local control for it to be successful. And it really does take into consideration what are the local needs and what are the assets within a particular community. And you can even really go down to like the neighborhood level, particularly in like a more urban school setting, and say like, what do we have in our neighborhood that we can be working better together to support students and families? And so I think that was really a beautiful thing to come out of that. And, I got my start in community schools as a community school coordinator for a local school district here in the Treasure Valley. And so I got to see firsthand, what does that look like to really take stock of the assets surrounding a particular school building, and start thinking critically about how can agencies work together to support students.
So one thing that I keep hearing you say, and I think it's really important to pull this out, is that you're calling it a community school strategy. Mm-hmm. And when I was doing some research for a different podcast, actually, it was just types of schools like that parents have access to for their students. Community schools was actually listed. I think Governor Little even mentions it, like, oh, it's a type of school that you have access to. But what I think is important to note, it's not a type of school. It's a strategy that's integrated into the school, yes, to be able to address the needs of the people who are there using the resources that are within the community. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really important distinction, because I think there's a little bit of confusion for some people when they're like, I don't get what community schools are. I don't get it.
Yeah, there's a like a branding challenge, because when you say the term community school and you maybe your lowercase c, lowercase s, that could mean your neighborhood school. But the community school strategy is truly that umbrella strategy that then different programs and activities can fit under. But it is taking like a true strategy lens and saying, okay, we're going to center the data we have available, understand what's going on in our school building, whether that's like academic data, demographic data, health data. And then we're also going to take a step back and see what's going on in our community that surrounds the school, and use that data and processes that are in place that have research behind them, processes in place to then begin addressing those needs. And so we can talk about what some of those like kind of processes are, like really part of like how the sausage is made of what makes a community school strategy successful. But I think one of the most important things that it takes repeating is that a community school is not a program. it's a strategy that can involve a variety of different programs.
So let's talk about the strategy. What is the community school strategy? And then how is it implemented into a local school?
Mm-hmm. And so community school strategy is at a neighborhood public school, and it's where stakeholders and school staff and community members are working together to ensure that every student can thrive. And so it's a very broad definition. But then when that strategy actually comes into action, it involves a few things. It involves the critical role of a community school coordinator, that person who has their eye on the ball. They are the relationship builder. They are the community connector. They are the person who is monitoring and adjusting efforts that have to do with programs and activities under the strategy. And then there's a few things that kind of happen regularly. I've talked a lot about like assessing needs in a community. And so conducting a formal needs and assets assessment that really lifts up the voice of the people who are most affected by any decisions being made. So voices of students, voices of families, voices of the community at large, really kind of trying to get to the heart of like, what should we be focusing on? Because if we focus on everything, we're not going to get anything done. So taking some like really just like we did with, the broader community health needs assessment in the Treasure Valley, bubbling up those top 3 ideas. I've seen community schools do it where they focus on their top 4 or their top 5 and say, in our school, we've listened to the voices of students, teachers, staff, parents, community members, and we know we should be focusing on out of school time, for example, or we know we should really be diving in and focusing on food insecurity because that's a huge need in our community. So those things that kind of bubble up by looking at the data, by talking to people, by really understanding what is the lived experience of a variety of people within our community, and then saying, okay, let's find, if we don't have the partners at the table to address this, let's go out and find them. And it looks really different in an urban setting versus a rural setting.
So what do you mean when you say if we don't have partners at the table, we need to go and find them? Do you mean partners within the school, like people who are already there, or what do you mean by that?
It could be either. Like if there's already an agency that's working with the school, and I could say agency, it could also be an individual, a faith-based organization. Those type of partners look different in every community. Perhaps it's the across the street church is already doing something to address food insecurity. Perhaps they already have a food pantry, but maybe it's not meeting the needs of the community. Maybe families who are enrolled in the school are for whatever reason not able to access it, or maybe the hours aren't right. That's getting into like a really specific example.
Well, I think that's really helpful though. Let's say like there was a need and they noticed that like winter clothing or something like that. Let's say winter clothing was a need. And this was something that I saw in a community, in a local school that my kids went to at one point. So it wasn't the school that addressed the need. The principal was actually connected with an outside entity, and the outside entity said, hey, we're going to do a coat drive.
Yeah.
And so the outside entity did a coat drive and then brought those coats in, and then they were able to distribute them. Is that what that means by using an outside entity?
It absolutely can look like that. And it really depends on like the school context, because maybe they do have a business or a civic association in the community who has the capacity to run a clothing drive. Maybe it's the school itself running the clothing drive. It just really depends on who is already in the community doing that work. And then maybe the school is the best place to distribute those coats. Maybe it's best that, maybe they're in a closet of a local thrift store that then they can work with the thrift store to get, make sure families have access. It just really depends, and it can take time. It can take trying something and being like, hey, is this going to work for families in our community? Or are there still barriers to accessing a resource?
So you've got your school, and at the premise of this community schools idea is that schools are at the heart of our communities. which I truly believe. And so then if schools are at the heart of our communities, then we're going to use that school to understand what the needs are within our like that community. And so then there's someone who's put in place a community school coordinator, and they're assessing the needs in that from that position, highlighting the top 3, 4, 5, and then figuring out how to use either the resources that are in the school that are already there or other groups around the community to get those needs met.
Yeah, I think thinking about that role as one of the facilitators, they're standing there kind of hand in hand with the school leader, the principal. And, the principals are often considered, the academic lead of the building. And then this is a partnership between the community school coordinator and the school principal to really take a look and dive deeply into those things that there might actually be, like, it might bubble up that in that community, there are academic needs they want to address. It's not just community resource based. I've seen community schools when they, look at the data and then they, let's say they go for their top 4. Maybe their top 4 is literacy, chronic absenteeism, like food insecurity, or access to like healthcare, for example. Like that could be a top 4 at a school. And so 2 of those are rather academic in nature, aren't they? Attendance and literacy. But strategies to address attendance might not actually be academic in nature, because perhaps the attendance issue is connected to the access to healthcare, right? And so it is really like being able to pull apart and having the community school coordinator there to really facilitate the process. They're not the only person doing the work, right? They're not the only one in charge of the community school success. That's shared ownership between all of the partners, right?
So where in Idaho are community schools? And how many do we have?
Yeah, right now there are 41 community schools across 25 school districts. There's a community school in every single education region in the state, from Coeur d'Alene to American Falls to Cascade to Rigby. There's community school strategy work happening in both rural communities, suburban, and urban school districts.
And so if you can just pull, maybe tell me what does a successful model look like? Like when you're thinking about these different models around the state, clearly, not everyone's created. They're not all maybe having the same type of success. So where is some place where there is some success, and give an example of like what they're doing?
Yeah, I think of, one of the ones I think of is American Falls. And that's a community that you can really tell by talking to their education leaders and both community members that everybody's all in. They've had some really great successes with early education and getting their community really involved and behind the students having access to early education. And then they have set up kind of a community center that is their resources hub for the district. And this model can look really different. A lot of our rural communities, you might end up seeing this kind of resource hub model where then they can coordinate to have services push into the district that might not have existed in that community otherwise. So I'm talking like health services, mental health services, partnering with other local agencies, even like the Department of Labor, to have like adults have access to, job searching services, like things like that. And yeah, I think one of the ways you can kind of, for me as somebody this has been, my profession for the last 8 years, when you walk into a school and you can really tell, like, this is the way they do school.
And what do you mean by that?
The collaborative nature, the always putting students first. This is student-centered work. And the way that a community can come and like wrap its arms around those children and families. And really it's not just for children and families who have resource needs. It improves everything about the school. And so you might see this is really, it is broadly considered a school transformation strategy. So you would see improvements in pretty much every way a school is measured. You would see that data improving and that school really excelling at what it's measured at.
So when you talk about, like, when I hear you say Idaho Falls, for example, and they're using the strategy, or not Idaho Falls, American Falls, at American Falls, when they're using the strategy and the community is coming together, I mean, and you talk about the buy-in that is there are then leaders who are, for me, I feel like what I'm hearing you say is that they're really instilling like this culture of coming together to address the community's needs. And I think that this probably for me is why I am so drawn to this community schools model, because I really feel like it's so important for communities to support around the school, right? And that there is something really to be said for coming together as a community and working together, and that really brings everyone together when that happens. And so that's what I feel like when you're talking about the community schools model, there is this, it's one of the ways that I think that I'm hearing you say that it's successful is through the leadership and creating that buy-in and the culture for like this inclusive, fostering of bringing everyone together in that way.
And I think one of the things that you can see in a school or school district that's, implementing this is that leader has their eye on the future. They're saying, what's this going to look like when I'm gone? What do I and my team have to do right now to ensure that when all of us leave our roles, which inevitably will happen, that this is in place because our community is demanding it, because they know it's the right thing to do. And this is how they've now agreed, like, this is what we expect out of our school. And it's not to say that the school has to take on everything. That's not what this is. This is working better together. There are already agencies in the community addressing all of these things. This is just really like the coordinating agent for them. And I think it's a very special thing. And I think our rural communities are already incredible at it. This is part of that resilience that rural communities have. People know each other. They work together. They put aside what they maybe don't agree on to focus on what's important, which is our children and their futures. And I think that it truly is something that people can get behind.
So do you know examples then, like if you're thinking about American Falls or maybe another, school around the state, what are things that these, the community school coordinator or the principal, what are they doing to create that buy-in to foster that healthy culture that can then perpetuate itself as years go on?
They might be doing a number of things, and I'll think about a particular example. I think one of those things is ensuring that the entirety of the staff know. So it's not just, okay, that's the community school that's happening over there. That's like a program or an add-on. No, they're very clear that like this is how we're functioning, and it goes up to like the leadership teams in the schools. And so that teacher leaders know what's happening, that this is an intentional strategy that we're using in a particular building, and that there is data to support it, and that there is, intentional efforts to engage families and the broader community. So I think schools that are doing this well are really like, they're putting their name out there. They're like, we are doing this as a community school. We are ensuring that everything that happens, people know that this is connected. It's not just like an additional add-on event. It's not, I think people get caught up, and I've heard it called this way, like all of these random acts of programming that just are people's particular passion projects that might happen in a school setting. But instead, it's like taking a real look and saying everything we do is intentional and it is attached to part of our broader plan here. And so I think, that teacher education, that really helping make sure that all of our classroom leaders know what this is and why we're doing it. And they know that it's a long-term strategy. It's not just that program that'll happen for 2 years and then, we're going to try something else. This will take time. And I think that's when I see that level of buy-in from school building leaders. It's that they know it's going to take time. They're committed to it. They're also committed to, you have to try and be willing to fail and reevaluate when it comes to like certain programs and activities. Because if you're not trying something new, you're never going to grow. And so I think it's part of that. And I've seen some leaders like really like lead courageously when it comes to that. And being, to some extent open to input, open to doing something differently, and then open to that adjustment that's needed once you gather enough information about what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I actually heard someone say recently, like on social media, it's this, I think he's a principal. He's got his, he has his doctorate, and I can't remember exactly what it is in, but I was hearing him say, he's been saying this a lot lately, that we put so much stress and pressure on educators to to meet all of the needs of our kids. And instead of saying it's interesting because he's given a few examples, like, okay, when you're at, the grocery store and the clerk is there checking you out, then would you ask the clerk to maybe come check out your car because it won't start so you can get home, right? He's using a lot of these different examples of how it almost would seem ridiculous to ask someone in one field to add something else that's not even within their realm, right? And so that is what I think a lot of educators feel that way, that, hey, my expertise are teaching. It's not okay, this child has some, bad behavior. I can deal with a little bit of that, but then it exceeds my skill ability because that's not what I'm trained in.
Absolutely.
And so I think one of the examples that I heard about from around the state was like, oh, they noticed that that students needed some access to some mental health support. And so this one school, and maybe I could be getting my examples wrong, but basically would an example then be of bringing in a psychologist, maybe like once a week or once a month, so that students could have access to that help and support. And then it's not basically what I'm suggesting, that it's not adding more to a teacher. It's actually letting the teacher do what they do best, which is teach.
Absolutely.
And then getting the resources that are already in our community, either to the school or some other hub, so that our teachers can teach and they can feel that support, right? And that culture. And then bringing in those resources that for other people who have expertise to meet the needs of the school, the kids and the community.
Yeah, I think sometimes we get in the position where our teachers and our school staff are asked to be experts in everything that has to do with a child. And, we know that when children enter, particularly our public school buildings, they enter with everything that's going on in their lives, whether that be, mental health needs that must be addressed, a lack of stable housing, a lack of access to food. And it's deeply unfair, I think, to ask our schools to become experts in all of those things when we have that expertise in our communities, right? And whether that expertise live at an agency or an organization, or whether it lives within individuals who've been addressing that. I think of an example up in Emmett, and Emmett School District has been implementing the community school strategy for a number of years. And I think I was in a community stakeholder kind of like gathering where they brought a bunch of different folks together just a month or two ago. And I had the chance to talk, and I'm going to forget the organization name, but they were kind of like a cross-faith group that brought together a bunch of different faith organizations to address food security and make sure that children and families had access to meals and access to food outside of their like scheduled meal times too. And that just makes me think like, our schools do not have to be the experts in everything. That's not their role. Their role is truly the provision of education and quality education. And so I do believe the community school strategy, when implemented correctly, you should hear directly from teachers in that building. It makes my job easier. It frees me up to teach. I don't have to put on my social worker hat. I don't have to put on my, find things for families hat. And it really should. we should leave those really important issues like mental health to licensed professionals. Because it's deeply unfair to the teacher and it's deeply unfair to the student and the family to expect that somebody go beyond their expertise in that way.
Amen. I really agree. I totally agree. And okay, so we've got a lot of these schools. We have 41 schools around the state that have the community schools model, the strategy integration. Your organization just recently applied. I mean, it was like a 2-year deal. I know, but it was a lot. You had so much to do with that. You guys applied, got a federal grant for $46 million. This was huge. Who was it? The Secretary of Education from, like, we're talking about from Washington, D.C.
The U.S. Secretary of Education.
I couldn't think of the words best.
Mr. Cardona.
Yes. He came out, presented this check. So you guys have $46 million. What are you going to do with the $46 million? How is that intended to help Idaho schools?
Yeah. So I'm going to start by talking about what the grant award was, and then I'll talk about the coalition of partners that is involved with it. So we were awarded a full service community school grant, and that's a grant that comes out of the U.S. Department of Education. And yes, we were lucky enough to host Secretary Cardona. He came out in November, end of November. We actually got the call over Thanksgiving. And he came to Boise to announce the grant awards for this year for the entire country, but we were one of them. And so the Full Service Community School Grant Award Program has been around, I believe, since 2008, and it really focuses on the implementation of community school strategy at a local level and supporting those organizations who are doing so. But I think for a long time, it was focused just on individual school districts or like maybe a consortium of school district partners and those like nonprofit and agencies who help facilitate community schools. So many United Ways have gotten this award in the past as well, as kind of like a lead agency. Which that's like a term we could get into if you want, but it just means they're the lead partner helping implement community schools at a local site. So that lead agency can be either a school district, a nonprofit, a university, or another agency. And so this award, we received an award in a state scaling category. So it is a statewide award intended to help. The project we put together is intended to help rural and Title I schools implement the community school strategy. Do you need me to define Title I?
Yeah. Why don't you do that? That'd be great.
Yeah. So Title I is a designation that schools get when they have a certain percentage of their population who qualify for free and reduced price lunch programs. And so it's an indicator of socioeconomic status. And so in Idaho, I believe the line is, and it's got some like, you'd want to talk to a federal programs person to get a better definition than what I'm giving you. But in Idaho, typically that bar is 40%. It can be 50% or higher, but let's just use the 50% bar. And that means 50% of the students at that school are a lower socioeconomic status. And so they typically receive, federal dollars to help support programming to specifically support those students who might not have the same opportunities at home or prior to entering school, and who may need additional like catch-up help and additional resources to support their learning. And so our grant award is focused on scaling the community school strategy across rural and Title I schools in Idaho. The other part of this statewide award is that we are building the ecosystem, the broader ecosystem where community school strategy can be successful in Idaho. And so that means increasing collaboration across agencies at the state level and at the local level. And so the award also helps us support our team that will be really lifting up the work of this coalition of partners. And that coalition is called the Idaho Coalition for Community Schools. And that coalition has existed since 2019. United Way of Treasure Valley has long been the fiscal agent, or like the backbone entity for this coalition, meaning we staff the work. We are the facilitators of this broad stakeholder group of people who are implementing community schools, are partners at community schools, and are just those advocates. They're people in the community who really believe this can be successful. And so this award brought together 25 partners. So not only is it an incredibly large grant opportunity, but I also believe it's one of the largest coalition grants, like multi-school district, multi-partner grant. So truly exciting. Sometimes it can feel like herding cats, but in a fun way.
And so what then are you going to do with, like, who has access? Who, if a parent were to say, or a school were to say, like, oh, I'm interested in integrating, the community schools model. We don't have funds within our district to be able to support this. How do they, that's kind of a twofold question. How is the money used on a local level for schools? Yes. And then who can use, like, how do you know if you can have a community school? I guess that's two questions.
Okay. Well, I'll start with the first question, which is how will the grant monies be used at a local level? And so the primary focus of these grant monies is funding the really critical role of a community school coordinator at a school site. And so the majority of the funds are going to support that local implementation and funding personnel and building local capacity to do this work. And so that building of local capacity can look like, yes, personnel. It can look like training. It can look like supportive activities and programs that align with the particular school's plan. And those plans are developed kind of like how we were talking earlier, through that process of bringing together community members, of looking at the data, and then setting forth and identifying those big things that the school community wants to work on. And then to answer question number 2, which is like, how can folks get involved?
Yeah.
We have a website, the Idaho Coalition for Community Schools.org. People can check that out. We are going to be having, as we we're on month 3 of a 5-year project. I don't think I mentioned that this is not just a fat $46 million check that's coming to us all at once. We developed a very scalable plan that we're going to be implementing over the next 5 years with grant partners. And so we had a number of partners join us in the initial proposal creation process. That was a requirement of the grant. We had to have a consortium of partners, including school districts. So we have some school districts who are a part of the grant from the get-go, and we will have another opportunity for schools and school districts to join us in the grant if they qualify. And just based off of the needs within, as we look at our state environment and look down at regions and things like that. But I think one of the best ways is just getting in touch with the coalition, we're going to be holding information sessions, connecting. I think another great way is connecting with other community schools. So if you work at a school, or you're a parent at a school that isn't currently implementing the community school strategy, I think one of the best ways can be to go look at what another school is doing. I think the easiest way to understand community schools is to go visit one. I'd actually recommend visiting more than one, because you can see all of the different ways that this strategy is implemented with local flavor, personality, the unique assets of a particular community. And it just can be really fun to see, well, what have other people done with this? And so, I think checking out our website, getting in touch, and then starting to learn. I think this is quite I would say community school strategy has quite a learning curve, but it's really just being open to doing things differently, or to making adjustments as you're going. And I think our schools are already fantastic at this continuous improvement process. So this is just kind of a framework to start thinking about things in a different way.
Yeah. So as I'm hearing you talk, when I was just thinking about being on the Lewiston School Board, and I was thinking about one of the part of the, and now I can't remember if it was part of the mission or values, but one of them was being a lifelong learner.
Yes.
And gosh, if I were a school board member today listening to this, I would be thinking like, is this a strategy that would help my school district, particularly if I'm in a rural or, have a lot of Title I schools? And because I think there's so much value in bringing in someone who is going to be a partner with that principal, and then be that like conduit for the community, right? And to be assessing on a pretty regular basis what the needs are, and I just think that culture within a school of working together and working as a team is so valuable within a school and for a community.
Yeah, and you specifically mentioned school board members, and for a number of years we've been present at the School Board Association annual conference. There's lots of ways to get connected with us and the partners who are working under this grant. One of the critical partners is, of course, our Idaho State Department of Education. We could not have gotten this award without their support and partnership. And so I think there's so many ways to get connected in with what we're doing. And there will be even more opportunities as we move forward and as we build out our team and our capacity to do this work at a state level. I think this grant is a truly amazing opportunity for both of those reasons. It's both a local capacity builder and then truly a state system builder. Because one of the things that Secretary Cardona said when he visited Boise and gave some, comments, we were at Whitney Elementary, which is a community school in the Boise School District, and he said, we need systems, not superheroes, and so it is truly about building systems that can outlast. Right now, we have a lot of superheroes in our school buildings and our systems, and we really need to build stronger systems so that we don't just stand on the shoulders of certain superheroes who are just going above and beyond every day. Not saying that those superheroes won't continue to exist, but we need our youth and our families, we need more than just superheroes.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that sentiment. And one of the things that I keep saying that phrase, one of the things, I'm sorry, I think I've said it quite a bit today, is that you and I got connected because I'm currently serving as the president for Idaho PTA, and I was looking up different ways for Idaho PTA to just be aware of what's going on around our state, and you and I connected in that way. And one of the things that you shared was that, as we've come together as a coalition, one of the things that we have noticed is that, parents are not at the table. And so first of all, that really struck me as like, gosh, these people really are thinking about a community and all members of a community, because we want you want parents to be sitting at the table. And then also just that, for parents around the state who are connected like with PTAs at their schools, if parents are interested, they can, you can get connected with the PTA, because we've been, the PTA has been invited to be a part of, your committee there. And I think that that's really profound as well, because I don't think that all states are doing, making that kind of an invitation to have parents at the table.
Yeah.
And that's profound to me.
And I think, we've been able to see kind of the roadmap. I've had the chance to talk with other, state level kind of community school leaders around the country. I'm connected in with some, a national coalition for community schools and some national networks. And if you see some of the states that have really implemented this type of work sustainably, it is because of parent and family advocates demanding that this is the way that school should be run in a state. And so I think of really particularly a couple state level examples that resulted in, really changing the way that our school systems are functioning. And that was because parents pushed for it.
I love that.
Yeah.
Oh, I love it. Okay. Well, this has been such an awesome conversation. And so at the end of every conversation, we always just do 2 key takeaways, like things from the conversation. If you're going to take away something, listeners, like what would those things be? So I'll start. And for me, one of the things that I'm taking away from the conversation is that the community school strategy, it was a phrase you used, was that it's an you're probably going to have to correct me, by the way, is that it's an opportunity to work better together or strong. What did you say? What was
Probably better together.
Better together. That I really just, it for me links in with what I think what I feel so deeply about school communities, and that we need to work together, that it's a team effort. And that for me, the community school strategy really promotes and fosters and implements that team strategy.
Yeah, I think to go off what you were saying, it's like there are proven processes for working together that are part of this evidence base that supports the community school strategy, that we don't have to recreate the wheel. This has been done in other communities. They've seen success. We've seen early success here in Idaho. We're on like year 8 of implementing community schools in this state. And to be able to receive a federal award, the Full Service Community School Award, in some ways should really give a lot of confidence that we are doing work that's getting recognized at a national level of being high quality, and that we've been entrusted with this catalytic investment to keep pushing this work forward. And it doesn't happen by accident. It happens by a lot of people doing really focused, intentional work over time. And I think that's how you ultimately move towards changing systems to better support students. So maybe that's my takeaway, is that it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, and really intentionally keeping your eyes on that horizon, but then making sure, students are at the center of that work. Our horizon is, students have the opportunity to thrive. And I think that's just really important. And it takes so many people to make that vision possible.
Yes, I totally agree with you. And I was just thinking about over the weekend how it's so important. I was talking with someone about what I'm trying to do with the podcast and kind of what I'm doing a little bit professionally, just trying to bring communities together. And you use the word intention. And if we're not intentional, then I just don't believe the work's going to happen. It doesn't just happen spontaneously. People have to be intentional about it. And that's what I like about this community school strategy, is the intentionality that goes into community building.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Haley, for joining. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what your organization, what comes and what continues to grow from community schools. So thanks for joining.
Oh, thank you for having me.